Hi and welcome to my channel. It's me, Emma Kenny. I'm going to be talking about true crime again today. By the way, I do know it's ironic that I'm wearing a Genius top because I'm absolutely without doubt not Genius, and also I think there's a Scrabble reference and I've never been able to play Scrabble in my life. But that aside, thanks for coming to my channel. I release content twice a week, Wednesdays and Sundays, so if you do love true crime and you want to keep up with me, please subscribe. Go on, it'll take you 1 second, but it makes a massive difference to me. Love all your interaction. Whenever I do a premiere, it blows my mind that so many of you are as intoxicated and compelled by the area of true crime. The case I'm going to be covering today is one because it's quite current because of some changes in the press, and that's why I've kind of hopped on to do this. I wasn't actually going to do this one this week, but because of the things that I'm seeing kind of funneling through, I think it's really important because this transfixed the nation when the disappearance of Milly Dowler occurred. Today, I'm going to be talking about Levi Bellfield, probably one of the most dangerous killers the UK has seen. Levi was born to Jean and Joseph Rabbits, and he comes from a line of Romany descent, but from a traveller background. He has a brother Richard and a sister Anne Marie. He did have some trauma. I think it's important that we note that, because when we think about the violence gene, which I'm going to do a whole separate YouTube video on regarding nature nurture, what we're learning about DNA, what we're learning about genetic predisposition, because it's blowing my mind at the moment. But he did have trauma at 9 years of age. His dad died of leukemia, which is obviously something that is horrific. When he was growing up, I'm going to be honest with you, he was known for being super scrawny, bit strange, really tiny physically, and he did get bullied relatively daily. He was made fun of a lot, particularly by girls. I think it's really important to note that at this point. And he was somebody that didn't necessarily know how to defend himself. I would add to that, however, he was idolised by his mother. A little bit weirdly, gonna be honest, when I tell you the stuff afterwards. So in spite of the fact of him having some trauma and also dealing with problems at school, which are horrible, it wasn't like his home life was horrible. In fact, quite the contrary, he was hero worshipped in his mother's eyes. Something that I think is always potentially fatal when you're dealing with somebody like a narcissist. Undoubtedly, Levi Bellfield is a narcissist. I want to talk to you about this from a different perspective as well, because I can go through the timeline of events, and I will do some of that, but I've had the pleasure of working on documentaries with particular victims, and Jo Collins is his ex-girlfriend, also mother to some of his children, and because of that I've got quite an in-depth knowledge of who he was and the way that he was within relationships. So it's all very well for me to do a chronology and to tell you what happened in the end, but I kind of think, who was he? What formed him? What was it like being in a relationship with one of the most prolific serial killers that we've seen in modern times? You know, this is a guy who, if he hadn't been caught, would undoubtedly still be killing. And I'm telling you now, the crimes that he has been found guilty for, he has done so many more. The ramifications of which we'll probably find out over the next 20, 30, 40 years, because it's coming. There's no way the people he's serving time for are the only victims that he had. So Jo Collins initially meets Levi Bellfield when she's 17. She's not interested in him at all at this point, but she does know that he's got this real air about him. He's known in the area. He's a bare knuckle fighter. He's a bouncer at a local pub, and he looks for fights wherever he goes. Remember what I said? He's a really scrawny kid, and in his adolescence decided that wasn't going to work for him and ended up just hammering the steroids, really going for it. In fact, he had a 19-inch neck, which you can see. He's not the most attractive individual when you look at him. He does look like he's really worked on those steroids a little bit too hard, and the consequences are that it's changed his appearance in a way that I wouldn't say is too flattering. But nonetheless, you can tell, therefore, at an early age, he's very aware of wanting physical domination and strength. He didn't like the way he looked, so he changed it. And this continuing requirement of dominance, looking for fights, being a bouncer, being involved in things that were a bit shady. He was known to sort other people out, shall we say, if you wanted a deal done and somebody needed their legs breaking, Levi Bellfield was the guy to go to. So not trying to be judgmental at this point, but not the kind of guy that you would want to live next door to. And bizarrely, which will always go straight over my head at this point, he's also known as a ladies' man. He was constantly unfaithful in relationships, and he was known to also have, shall we say, a predilection for schoolgirls in particular. The younger, the better for Bellfield. Now, Joe was 17, so perfectly his type at the time, but it took 5 years for him to actually get her to go on a date with him. She wasn't interested. Firstly, she was kind of middle class. She was a horse rider. She was somebody who was kind of separate to the kind of life that he had. But he caught her at a very vulnerable time. Basically, she was crying one night in the pub and he went over to see what was wrong with her. He could be incredibly charming, incredibly generous, and very nice to be around in certain moments. She just lost her father, so there was that connection. He'd lost his father, she'd lost hers, and pretty much from the get-go, he just asked her again and again to go out for a date with him. And even though he wasn't really her type initially, she agreed. And when she went on that first date, he showered her with gifts, chocolates. He was absolutely amazing with her. And bizarrely, he moved in with her the same night at her mother's house. Now, I'm all about boundaries, guys. So with respect, as much as I love my children, I love them dearly. If one of them was to turn up with a new partner and say, "Hi, Mum, they're moving in," I'd be like, I don't know this person and you haven't even been involved in a relationship with them. So I think we're probably going to slow this down a little bit. We're not even at the point where they're staying over a night, let alone bringing their personal possessions to the front door. But okay, everyone's different. It was a challenging time. There was grief in the air. Her mother may well have just wanted to make sure that Joe was given an opportunity to have happiness. And there's always two sides to a story, isn't there? Now, the issue with Levi Bellfield at this point is that what he hasn't told Joe is that he's still in a relationship with someone else. This is his typography, really. Throughout his relationships, he's always involved with other people. So Joe's completely unaware of this at the point that they get together, and the only reason that she finds out is because the girlfriend of Levi Bellfield just turns up screaming blue murder, absolutely going off her head that she's in this relationship and Joe has stepped on her territory. Unlike me, who would have been happily and neatly packing his bags and dropping them off directly for Joe to take so I could get on with my life without the maniac that he was in my life. Each to their own. Now, it did not take long when he went into the relationship with Joe for him to become more and more controlling. This is what we expect to see in coercive control relationships. So now initially there isn't violence, but there is definitely this incremental grading of control. The thing about Joe, when you watch her and you hear her talk and you read her narrative and story, which I've read fully because I was very lucky enough to be involved in a documentary where I saw all of her narrative, you know, all of the things that didn't go on television. And she is a very forgiving person. She's also massively resilient, so she's unique in that way. Things can happen to her, but she somehow minimizes them. Because one of the ways that she's manifested coping with being in a relationship with this killer is to make him 90% of the time a wonderful person. So she put up with the 10% that was really bad because 90% of the time he was charming and wonderful and endearing and clever, as she put it. She saw him as a lovable rogue, and if you could just have got rid of the violence, her words, not mine, he would have been a nice person. And there's that bit in me that's like, yeah, but Joe, the fact that he was very violent kind of means that he wasn't a nice person, and you could say that about Myra Hindley. We could all say, if you just got rid of all the really bad stuff about the person, they'd be a good person. But it's her coping strategy. Do you know? How do you ever deal with coming out of a very abusive relationship? You have to have reason that made you stay. And it's true. A lot of people in very violent or coercively controlled relationships stay with a partner, not because they're violent and coercive 90% of the time. It's the opposite. It's 10% of the time. So they're always dreaming that if they could just change, if this sorry really is sorry, then everything will be okay. And so Jo falls into that paradigm to some degree. I will give it to Jo's mum. In spite of the fact that she did let him move in, she could not stand him. She couldn't stand him from day one. Mother's intuition doesn't fail you. You just know. I know there are mums out there nodding. I know there are dads out there going, fathers have it too, but I'm just saying, I'm only a woman, so I wouldn't know, but I appreciate that you probably would too. That's how controlling he is. He literally gets the hackles up on her mother's neck immediately. And I'm going to go into the micro detail of the kind of control he exerted over Jo in her own home, in her mother's home. So she couldn't go to the toilet without him. If she did go to the toilet without him, she needed to leave the door open so that he could see what she was doing. Is it just me who thinks most of us don't need to know what somebody's doing when in the toilet? Kind of goes with the territory what you're doing, doesn't it? But that's what he'd do. She couldn't make calls without him, and if she was on one end of the phone, of the house phone, he'd have the other end to make sure he could listen in. He went everywhere with her. It was down to what she ate, what she wore. So this was very much micro detail control. That's an exhausting, persistent state to be in. You are constantly thinking, well, it's going to be too much of an effort to fight, so I'm just going to go with what they want. And remember, Jo, again, her own words, specifically her own words, interviewed, he was either perfect or a psycho. Again, perfect or a psycho. So a psycho, really, is what she's saying. But again, drawing down on that belief system that because you've chosen to be with someone, there must be endearing qualities about them, even if they are psychopathic, in your opinion, at times. Jo gets pregnant, and throughout that first pregnancy, he is absolutely wonderful to her. There's no violence, he's kind, and he's one of those human beings who seems to transition during that initial pregnancy, and Jo starts thinking, well, maybe he could be a decent father. And again, using her own words, she said that when she did have her baby, she couldn't fault him as a father. But he was also at this point starting to physically abuse her. So I can fault him as a father. He's a terrible father. He's a domestic abuser, meaning that a child can witness violence towards another parent, meaning that a child can be traumatized, meaning that a child can live patterns of horrible consequence because of that. But Jo genuinely felt that he was a good dad. Aside from the fact that arguably he did kick her in the stomach when she was pregnant with her second child. From my point of view, I think what we have is this distortion level from Jo's perspective. I don't think she wants to maximize the reality. I think she's overwhelmed with the horror that was inflicted to her and to her family. And the way that she manages her resilience is to believe that to some degree she was in control. That yes, these horrible things were happening, but she could see all the good points about him. She could deal with the bad points. And when she looked at him as a father, that made her stay. But from my point of view, he sounds like a horrific partner to have. But in her words again, and this is taken directly from the transcript that I read and saw, in her own words, couldn't have asked for anyone nicer. I mean, I've got a list, and quite a few of them have actually killed people, and they're still nicer. But again, this is how we deal with it psychologically, isn't it? We minimise to cope. Now, after the second child's born, Jo does admit that the beatings get really, really severe. He's also massively unfaithful. He's always unfaithful to the women that he's with. Doesn't really have any respect for women whatsoever, apart from his mother. And when Jo gives birth to her son, he's actually living with another woman. So she is seeing him as a partner, but he's also living with another woman. But to some degree, she doesn't see that as a problem in her words because she sees it as a more peaceful experience. You know, she doesn't have to put up with him all the time. So he's visiting the kids and he's visiting her, but he's also seeing someone else. Now, the point of break in the relationship comes when Jo's daughter, who's very young at the time, she's been ill in hospital, and the doctors have said very clearly that the only reason that she's allowed to go home is if she has a fan on her to keep her cool because her temperature's really up. And obviously Jo, like any good mum, wants her home, wants to be able to take care of her in her own environment, so she agrees to do that. And just after she's got home and she's got the fan on and her child is getting the soothing that she needs, Levi Bellfield turns up on Joe's doorstep, basically says, I want the fan, it's obviously hot weather. She says no, and he, in her words, kicked the shit out of me. She was also pregnant at that point too. This is the man that she's described as perfect or a psycho. I think we can probably all agree at this point that Joe has realised that while she isn't intimidated by him, and she isn't, I'll be honest with you, I've watched Joe interviewed on many occasions, I've read her transcripts, she was never scared of him. She always saw him as somebody who was very violent, but it wasn't that she felt cowed into fear, if that made sense. And then after this, and she breaks it off, it feels like the power dynamic shifts, at least in her opinion. He constantly stalks her. He genuinely does those really petty things, like sends loads of pizzas to her house, loads of takeaways to her house, loads of taxi drivers to her house. She's constantly opening the door and having to say, yeah, I don't want this pepperoni pizza, and no, I don't want to go to the centre of London in a taxi. But it was as if he could not handle that she had placed herself in a position where he was denied that power. One of the things that Joe talks about as well that always kind of struck me as difficult to hear is, even if this hasn't made it onto TV, this is how she's talked about it in the past, that when he kind of wasn't exerting that power over her, she really felt like it was a security blanket that had gone. Because he'd micromanaged every single detail of her life to such a degree that to some degree she felt that when it had left, her life was obviously free, and finding that control again for yourself is something that was psychologically challenging. I think that's really brave of her, but it also gives us that insight, doesn't it? This is how it feels when you're in a domestically abusive relationship. You don't know whether to look left or right, you just look in the direction they ask you to. So when you can look left or right, everything feels so much more confusing and complex. This is why so many victims struggle with the post-trauma, because they know that that person isn't an ally, but they also know that that person has been a huge part of their world and what they've experienced within that world, including whether they go to the toilet with the door open or otherwise. At this point, sensibly, when she's getting lots of pizzas delivered and so on and so forth, she knows she needs to get an injunction. Within an hour of that injunction being served to Levi Bellfield, he just rips it up, posts it through a letterbox. So he's just letting her know that as far as he's concerned, he genuinely doesn't care. And he carries on with this relentless sending of pizzas and deliveries. And on one occasion, the police are literally at her house and he calls her on a withheld number. And she says, this has to stop. The police are at my house. And he says, oh, I don't believe you. And the officer says, we are at the house. And he just says to her, well, they won't know where I am. They can't trace this. It's a withheld number. And the police officer says, yes, we can. And at that point, the pizza stopped getting delivered. But it shows you, doesn't it, the relentless pursuit, because she is denying him what he wants. And he's going to punish her until he gets what he wants. And Joe gets back with him. So when you think about consequences, when you think about boundaries, it's really important not to have these massive flexible ones, because if you break down that boundary and you allow somebody to return after this diabolical, destructive, coercive, violent behavior, you're essentially rewarding them for it. So even though you may think that you had the power, you don't. You've exonerated them from any guilt whatsoever, because they are now worthy of you again, meaning that everything that they did to you was valid. And if you're listening now and you're in a relationship of violence, you'll understand why I'm saying that. You have to cease that relationship. You have to keep the consequences clear. You have to keep the barriers and boundaries high, because otherwise, once they come down, you are in severe danger. Obviously, he became charming again initially, because that's what they do. And Joe talks about the fact that, he was really intelligent, he knew about wine, he was the kind of guy who'd help you if your car broke down. And in fact, neighbours who knew Levi Bellfield said whenever he moved to a certain place, he'd always be really helpful for a while. You'd think, oh, this is a good guy. It won't take long for the cracks to show. But initially, he was good at being charming. And we see this a lot in psychopathic killers, that contrary to what people believe, many are charming, good looking, live with a partner, have a decent job, go about their daily life, seemingly mingling in between us without really raising an eyebrow. Oh, and yes, they can murder people without conscience, but they're completely sane. That's what makes them so dangerous. Joe was even on the phone when Levi Bellfield carried out a really serious attack. A friend of hers, Pete Rodriguez, was living with Levi Bellfield and he couldn't handle it. The chaos, there was violence, it just was not a good space. And Joe was friends with him too, and she'd actually said to him, look, you can move into my spare room, just do not tell Levi Bellfield that you're doing that, because he'll go crazy. At that point, on the phone, having that conversation, Levi Bellfield took a hammer, smashed it through Pete's head, and almost killed him. He went to hospital and he was seriously ill. But because he was so scared of what would happen if he told the truth about this event, if he actually came out with the truth and used that to put Levi Bellfield in prison, he was worried about the consequences. And it does not surprise me. Levi Bellfield was very well connected. He was not somebody that you messed with. So to some degree, you can imagine that Peter Rodriguez was thinking, it's probably better for my health and wellness if I just don't give any evidence, if I don't take him to court. But that makes me go, because this is the thing, if people don't react when somebody carries out a savage attack, look, if you're going to hit somebody in the head with a hammer, you are willing to kill them. You don't hit somebody in the head with a hammer lightly. You don't hit somebody in the head with a hammer casually. It's not, oh, I'll just slap you in the head and hope that, I don't damage you at all. You do it because you want to do and inflict serious damage. So Levi Bellfield at this point didn't care if he killed Peter Rodriguez, and it's really fortunate that he survived. But it says missed opportunity, right? Missed opportunity. In fact, Jo, not long after this is going on, when they've split up, she's searching her garage in Strawberry Hill. And she comes across what she calls on reflection. So this is on reflection, not necessarily in the moment when she was dealing with what she found. But she came across a rape kit. There were gloves, there was a large knife, there was tape. Now, on reflection, she sees this as a rape kit. But at the time, she's in a garage, she knows it's not her stuff. But I suppose it wouldn't have been completely untoward in that situation. But what would be is the Cosmopolitan magazine that she finds, where Bellfield has gone through every single picture of a blonde-haired woman and stabbed it. Every single picture of a blonde-haired woman he'd stabbed through. And I imagine, knowing Cosmopolitan, that would probably have been pretty much every page. So what is he telling us there? What is it about his absolute hatred towards blondes? And I wonder back to those days at school. He wasn't an attractive guy. He was very small. He obviously didn't have the physical demeanour where he could deal with bullies. And it seemed to be that girls in particular bullied him. And I'll tell you a little bit why that happened later on. You'll probably understand why they did. But you remember the pretty girls at school? Maybe that's his image of who those blondes were. He has this predilection, we know all through his life, for schoolgirls. But maybe those beautiful blondes, the girls who were at school who were undeniably completely out of his reach, maybe this is that seething reflection of rage, because he's got such an entitled attitude in his life that maybe they denied him what he believed he was due. Jo also recalls that Levi Bellfield had a really unusually close relationship with his mother, and believe me, when I go into this in a little while, you are going to be like, really, Jo? I mean, when we're talking about minimizing, oh my God, that statement close relationship, unusually or otherwise, minimised beyond belief. And the reason I've told you about Joe before I actually go into the killings that Levi Bellfield carried out, it's because I want you to be able to see how coercive control can impact on the way that people perceive situations. Because even when Levi Bellfield was arrested for the murder of Milly Dowler and obviously completely denied that he'd done it, Joe said that her kids found out and they coped fine. You know, they just accepted it. Because aside from the violence, he's a good man. Also, she noted that some of the children, not hers, who are related to him, have kept his name and are proud of it. She also described the press attention that she got as exciting, and at the same time says that she knows that he will never get out of prison, and she's hugely glad for that fact. And Joe, I will tell you, is a main player in how he's brought to justice. So she is a force to be reckoned with. But wow, the minimisation. It's sad that she does have guilt. She feels guilty for not telling the police how dangerous he was. Obviously, Peter Rodriguez probably feels the same way. But one of the things that she tries to get across when she talks about this is that you can survive. You can be a victim of coercive control and you can survive. But she's also talked about the fact that since him, there's been very little relationships within her life because she doesn't trust anyone. She just doesn't trust men. She doesn't believe that they won't turn into some kind of monster. So I'm going to have to say, in spite of resilience, clear damage is there, and you would understand it, wouldn't you? But the minimising is what really gets me, that almost Joe has had to survive by taking the enormity of the horror and putting it into a small box and saying, well, I'm not going to let that affect me or my children. And I hope that's how it manifests in her life and in her children's life. I really do, because I would much rather have someone not traumatised and able to continue than completely traumatised in a way that destroys their life. She is a force to be reckoned with. I'm not being judgmental of her at all. It's just because I've got this insight. It almost says to me, this is how somebody manages to survive an encounter with somebody like Bellfield. You know, how do you cope with having been in love or being loved by a monster? And he is a monster. I'm going to use that word because he acts in monstrous ways. His behaviour is monstrous. How do you imagine that you have the genetics of that monster living in your children? How do you manage that? Because Jo knew he was very violent. She knew that he was somebody with terrible form, but she did have children with him. She's indelibly linked to this murderer and always will be. So let's look at how Levi Bellfield really came to our knowledge at all. Obviously, he's a serial killer, but I think most of us will know more about him because of Milly Dowler. Milly Dowler was a 13-year-old girl who got off a bus and then was seen waving to her friends, and within about 20 yards of distance where there is a break from CCTV, within that 20 yards of CCTV footage that isn't there, she just disappears. Just gone. And we know early on, firstly, this is massively out of character. Secondly, Milly was not the kind of girl who would have got into a car with anyone. She's very feisty. So automatically in the area that she goes missing, there is panic. I'm going to come back to Milly later on because there is so much more in this particular horrible tale. But really, she's a big part of it. Because for most people in the UK, at least of my age, 10 years younger and older, you'll know the name Milly Dowler. You'll know the schoolgirl who went missing and wasn't found for 6 months. So on the day that Milly Dowler does go missing, and I'll go into this in detail later on, 34-year-old Levi Bellfield is sat with his 23-year-old girlfriend Emma, the house sitting. And that day wasn't out of the ordinary at all. In the evening, they get a takeaway together, have some drinks, just carry on as normal. But then about 3 o'clock in the morning, he says to her, you know what, I can't sleep and I want to go back to your flat because I sleep better there. So he takes her car and he drives back to her flat at 3 a.m. in the morning because he wants to sleep. I think that Emma at that point was suspicious that something was weird going on. Obviously, he's a constant adulterer, but she probably didn't want to challenge him. And why would you? He's a violent narcissist. So she just lets him go. 3 days after she gets back to her flat from this house sit, and she's immediately suspicious because her bedding's been removed. Levi Bellfield has an excuse straight away. He's like, the dog messed up on it, but also her car's missing. And he says, you know what, I was drinking, I went out, had a few drinks, and I left it where the pub was. So they get in a taxi and they go to the place where the car's going to be, and it's gone. And the car's never been found. So this is where the web begins, because it's so intricate. And this is one of those cases where you know that certain detectives played an unbelievable role to make sure that those kind of facts were brought out to connect the dots. And this is a case of dots being connected. It was not simple policing. Now, when I look at Levi Bellfield's history, a lot of people thought he was a nice guy. But wherever he lived, he became an absolute nightmare. In fact, in one area, he was known to bully the elderly. Literally made his elderly neighbours' lives a complete nightmare. He also did crazy things, like he put barbed wire around the fences on his home. He had 2 aggressive dogs that were attack-based dogs. And people looked at his home and thought, what are you trying to protect? Because who's coming to rob you? What enemies have you got with your barbed wire and your violent dogs in a normal house in suburbia? It's strange, isn't it? He's trying to either present an image or he's genuinely aware that people might be paying him a visit, shall we say. Neighbours did say that over a period of time, Emery's girlfriend did seem to become more and more withdrawn. Obviously, she would have been being beaten up and she would have been told what to say and do. So we're seeing this pattern. It's his MO, isn't it? It's the way that he acts. 6 months after Milly disappears, her body's found. And her body was found dumped in the woods by mushroom pickers. But the case goes cold, essentially. It's not that the police aren't constantly looking for her. It's that things are happening that make it difficult to place anybody at the scene and to find forensic evidence. And that's what they need to find a way of pinning the crime on a criminal. So how does Levi Bellfield end up being found guilty for the horrific and sustained attack on Milly Dowler? Well, it begins, as far as the police are concerned, with their evidence on the 4th of February 2003. It's a normal night for Marsha McDonald. She's been to the cinema with friends and she's caught the bus home, the 111 bus. She gets off about 120 yards from her parents' house. And someone from nowhere, and she's just yards away from her parents' house, minding her own business, strikes her in the head with a really heavy object violently, then walks away. She dies the following day. There's no reason. It comes like a bolt from the blue. It's a blitz killing. Killed, gone. Instant. No molestation, just death by rage. The only link the police have in that crime is a silver Vauxhall Corsa. And the big problem here, and it's the same in any situation where a murder occurs completely out of the blue, what's the motive? You want a motive. So even though people would say, oh, have you got problems with any people? That would be a motive. Or sexual molestation, that would be a motive. This woman, this young girl, has been walking home doing absolutely nothing wrong. There's been one massive, profound blow to her head, and then she's been left. So it's about total power and control, isn't it? It's about overpowering and executing someone. She had blonde hair, remember that. Now, Bellfield at this point is working as a doorman. He's a bully, he's really big, he's very, very aggressive, to the point where exes talk about the fact that they'd often get phone calls saying that they needed to come and calm him down because he was going to go off. I think that was very much to do with the fact that he always considered himself a weakling. He had these huge inadequacies, these huge insecurities about who he was, and he wanted to prove the world wrong, along with, I think, a whole heap of genetic material that made him predisposed to be a hunter of other human beings. As I've said, he lost his dad as a child, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about his mom and him. Because I understand, when you go through a trauma as a parent and you witness a child go through a trauma, you want to protect them. I get it. We are going to allow our child to co-sleep at times. We are going to fall asleep in bed stroking their head as they cry. Yes, normal parenting. His mother wiped his arse until he was 12 years old. That is not even a lie. His mother wiped his arse until he was 12 years old. He slept in his bed with his mother until he was 16. And even when he was in his 30s, if he went back to stay at hers, he slept in her bed then. Now, I'm all for tight, fused, loving bonds, right? But that is trespassing over boundaries. That is not a normal, typical parent-child relationship. We know that she hero worships him. We know that he can do no wrong. We know that in her eyes, he is the golden boy. But to physically wipe the bottom of your 12-year-old child, unless they happen to have 2 broken arms or have special needs, which is completely acceptable, it's not acceptable to do that to a high school child. He should be firstly doing that for himself, and secondly, he's going through puberty. That's not what you do. If social services got wind of that, believe me, she would potentially be up for abuse charges, and in my opinion, rightfully so. Now, add to that what you would imagine, the confusion. He's lost a father, he's being bullied. We can see a whole cooking pot of problems. Let me tell you a little bit about why he started getting bullied at school. And this particular action is something that many have confirmed as being in truth. I can't confirm it. I wasn't there. I'm glad I wasn't there when I tell you this. But it definitely fits his MO. When he's 14, he's seen to have sex with a rabbit and then he breaks the rabbit's neck. That's the rumour. And from then on, he's given the title by his peers, Bugsy. It horrifies me, the idea that he did that. But it doesn't surprise me. In fact, when I listen to police reports, and I've heard some of the officers and detectives in the case talk about this, they actually say that nothing surprises them. That's what they had to learn, to not be surprised by Levi Bellfield. That, in fact, when you thought he couldn't get any more depraved, any more disgusting, any more outside the realms of typical, a piece of evidence would come up that would make them rethink what makes human beings human. So him having sex with a rabbit, then breaking its neck, totally would not surprise me at all. What is that saying about his rage, though? And his sexual depravity? He's getting really angry. And I can see that juxtaposition in his life. He's a hero at home with his mother, breaking all these boundaries, but he can do no wrong. And yet at school, there is this reverse. He's ignored by peers, laughed at by peers, ridiculed by peers, considered strange, pathetic, and now a rabbit shagger. It's obviously going to be something that causes him some kind of conflict, gives him no license to do what he did, and certainly no license to do what he did to that rabbit. So you can see, looking back on his childhood, that we have got the motivation and possibilities for him to grow into somebody very dangerous, along with, as I said, what I think is a born predisposition. The next crime we hear about is Kate Sheedy. She's 18 years old. She's on her way home, been out with friends. She got the bus home, and when she gets off the bus, she basically sees that there is a vehicle in front of her and it's pulled over in front of her, and she just has that intuition, that instinct that she might be in danger, which is absolutely correct. She was so intuitive, so important that you listen to that instinct. So she crosses the road. Now, Levi Bellfield is sat in that car and he is angry because she has been clever and outwitted and outsmarted him. He thinks she's going to walk past the car and then he can get her. But no, he knows that she sensed that she could be in trouble. So she walks across the road and he finds that unacceptable. So he pulls out in his car and he drives at speed and runs her over, and then he reverses back over her purposely and he leaves her for dead. But Kate Sheed is a fighter and her life clings in the balance for days. And I'm talking horrific injuries. I'm not going to go through them all, but she had broken ribs and a ruptured spleen. I think we can all agree that she was incredibly lucky to survive, but she did. And not only did she survive, as she recovered, she started to remember very specific pieces about the vehicle. It was a big white people carrier and it had blacked out windows. And the other thing that she saw was the driver's door mirror was broken. And that van had actually been captured on CCTV, but for some bizarre error, administratively, it wasn't passed on. It wasn't passed on to the police. That could have solved, at this point, Levi Bellfield being guilty of that attack. But it went cold. So all leads go cold at this point. Levi Bellfield, throughout his life, was known to be unpredictable, known to have massive rage. This could be to do with being linked to all those steroids he took, trying to become a bodybuilder as a teen to try to look tough. This deeply inadequate mummy's boy is now potentially physically dangerous because of that. But also we could additionalise that maybe the steroids did contribute to some of that aggression. That said, I've known a lot of people in my life who've taken steroids and they're pussycats. So arguably, I think this is something more inherent within his nature. When he was working as a doorman, we also know he would constantly bully and dominate girls into having sex with him. I believe that if this happened now, he would be arrested and charged with rape pretty immediately because young people are much more savvy about consent. But back in the early 2000s, it was a lot more complex. So bouncers did have power. And I can remember bouncers when I was a young person. They were kind of people that you revered. You didn't want to get on the wrong side. If they showed you attention, a lot of people would really enjoy it. But he was known to go for particularly young girls. So I would imagine those who were underage and shouldn't have been drinking, that would give him an extra layer of power. And he would basically bully them into going upstairs into this room in the bar and he'd have sex with them. He'd also use that people carrier that I was talking about with the darkened windows and he'd take them there, he'd have a mattress in it, he'd have sex with them there. He was an absolute sexual predator. So let's look at that for a minute. We're not just dealing with a blitzed killer, a strike and they're out. We're dealing with a sexual predator, a molester, a paedophile, a rapist. And this is something that he's doing every week, every single week. 3 months after Kate Sheedy's attempted murder, and my God, she nearly died, she nearly was a murder, the body of 22-year-old Milly Dowler was found on a cricket pitch. Again, she had received a really severe blow to the back of her head, just one. She died shortly afterwards. She was a French student. She was over here just to live and experience the UK. She lived in a really safe village. She'd been on a night out with her friends again, and sadly, a sliding doors moment had occurred. She'd fell asleep on the bus. She actually spoke to the driver and said, "Hey, how long will the bus take to take me back?" And he said, "About 10 minutes. But it was a really nice evening, so she decided to walk back to her home. And that was a fatal mistake, because Bellfield walked up behind her and struck her with such intensity, it killed her. But now police have a link, because Marsha McDonald had been killed in exactly the same way. And they're looking at this because blitz killings are very, very rare. Think about all the times I've talked about previous murders. It's usually a drawn out process. It's a time of torture. That's kind of what you're expecting. Not these really rare, random blitz attacks where somebody just goes out, hits somebody on the head, kills them and goes. These are very unusual. So that's 2 murders and 1 attempted murder in a 3 to 4 mile radius. That is incredibly scary, both for the people living there, but also for the police, because they know that in these areas this would not be expected to be happening, and also they have somebody on the loose who is highly dangerous. So between 2002 and 2004, that was a triangle essentially of murder. That was the way they described it as police. It was a triangle of murder. They could see the radius that murderer was travelling. Now, during this period of time, Bellfield is up to his old tricks as far as making money and intimidation. And he started this clamping company. And I got to give it to him, the guy had some brass. He would go up to a car, parked potentially legally, would put a clamp on it, and then when the person came back to the car, he'd demand 400 quid. He'd intimidate them, he'd threaten them, and he'd get the money. He also put adverts in the classified ads in papers offering prostitute services from an address, basically saying there was a masseuse. And when a prostitute was booked, he'd tell them the address, the person would drive to the address, he'd tell them where to park, and guess what? When they went back to the car after finding that there was no address to go to, he'd be stood there with the clamp on the car. That's a sex power link, isn't it? So even when he's thinking about people using prostitutes, it's the sex that he's thinking about, and then the domination that he has when he extorts this money from them. He extorts the cash and he humiliates them. It's the, I know what you were doing, you better pay up. So all throughout these murders, he's just carrying on absolutely as normal. He has absolutely no concern about being caught. But you know, sometimes from beyond the grave, victims get to have their justice. And Bellfield's made a mistake when he killed Emily because he took her phone. So when the police start investigating this phone, they realise, because of where the mast is picked up and from where the scene of the crime is, that the person had left in a car. It had travelled too much of a distance. And a piece of evidence that they bring out is that a Ford van was seen leaving the scene of that crime. And this is where Joe Collins comes back in, because Joe Collins walks into the police station and says, that's my ex's van. I believe it's Levi Bellfield that you're looking for. The police now have a name, but obviously that isn't enough. But Detective Colin Sutton, who, believe me, I've worked with him on other series, he starts digging deep because he's got that key information. He looks at Bellfield's past. He sees that previously he's been arrested in a people carrier. That people carrier matches the description Kate had given on the night that she was run over. The evidence also suggests that he has both a white van, a people carrier, and a third car, a silver Vauxhall Corsa owned by Levi Bellfield. He was arrested on 20th November 2004. And actually when he's arrested, he kind of gets wind of it. And so when they go in the house to look for him, they can't find him. But just call it an officer's instinct. One of them decides they're going to go look in the attic. And guess who they find? A naked Bellfield. One can only imagine the image. I would imagine that that officer required some kind of therapy afterwards, because a naked, crouching Bellfield would not be something that you would lose sight of in your brain, burnt into its memory for eternity and onwards. But this is when the police realise that this man was likely to have done so much more damage than they previously thought. And to put this into context, at one point, the police had 27 separate investigations into murder, sexual assault and rape by Levi Bellfield. And the police, as I said, just started to get used to assuming that whatever came up, whatever bizarre things were said about Levi Bellfield, were likely true. Now, the police have also said that the reason that they think that Levi Bellfield went for the women that he went for was, firstly, they were blonde, but secondly, he used the buses at night to highlight whether they were alone. That meant that he could almost track them. He could see that they weren't going to be protected. They were all young, they were all blonde, they could have all been schoolgirls. In particular, we liked pretty middle-class girls who were blonde to hurt. When the police took all of the statements from his exes, every single one of them said he was abusive. And the police believed that Bellfield was hunting from the minute that he hit adulthood. They believe that he was hunting women in one way, shape, or form throughout his entire adult life, everywhere he went. When the detective charged him, he said he made a direct decision to look in his eyes, just to look at him, to see the reaction when he said he was being charged. And he said the eyes didn't even flicker. Levi Bellfield just said, not guilty. He was charged with the murder of Marsha McDonnell and Milly Dowler and the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. One of the journalists who saw him in court said that when he watched him, all he saw was a man who looked bored. When he was cross-examined, he was very softly spoken, quite charming, tried to appear honest, and he actually said at one point, I'm fighting for my life here in court. And you're like, yeah, the life that you denied all of your victims. Touch of the drama there, I believe. Unsurprisingly, guys, he was found guilty of every single murder. He was given a whole life tariff. They are rare. A whole life tariff means you're going to die in prison. So on one level, he's now off the streets. And that's really important. We've got him. We've got him off the streets. Other women aren't going to die needlessly at his hands. But the investigation hasn't ended here. And this is a twist in the story. Because the police carry on diligently looking through the information that they've got about him. And they realise that where he used to live with his girlfriend Emma was just 20 yards away from where Milly Dowler went missing 6 years earlier. Remember, Milly Dowler was last seen on CCTV, as was a red Dianexia. And the truth is that until this point, no one had considered that Levi Bellfield could have been responsible for this. What we know now, although it didn't come out in the early days when we found out that he'd been charged because it was too horrific to talk about them, is that Levi Bellfield abducted Milly Dowler. He took her to the driveway of his mother's home where he raped her in broad daylight over the boot of a car. He then moved her to Emma's flat. Remember what I said earlier on about him disappearing at 3 o'clock in the morning because he couldn't sleep? That was because he had Milly Dowler held at Emma, his then girlfriend's flat. He then raped Milly Dowler and he tortured her. It went on for many, many hours. It went on into the next day. And that's when he strangled her. I can only imagine the horror that poor girl was going through. And then he just dumped her in the woods. Cleaned up the flat. Got on with life. Unbelievable. So in 2011, finally, for Milly Dowler's family, they get justice. Bellfield goes on trial at the Old Bailey. Yeah, he denies it. It's his MO. I didn't do it. It wasn't me. He's yawning when he's found guilty. Can you believe that? He's actually yawning. He can't be bothered with it. I mean, he's already in life for a full term, so why show any emotion? You don't care. He doesn't even go to be found guilty. Can you believe that? He refuses to attend court. I actually have an issue with that. I'm not going to lie. I have an issue with that. What right does he have to not attend that trial? He should have been dragged kicking and screaming into that courthouse. No one should have a right to not have to be there where the victim's parents and family get to look at you being sent down yet again. But that's how little he cares about anybody but himself. He doesn't want to give anybody the satisfaction. In February 2012, he actually appeals. He actually challenges the conviction for Milly's kidnap and murder, even though he is bang to rights. And then in 2016, he admits it. We didn't need you to admit it. We all knew that you were guilty, but at least, Levi Bellfield, you have given some comfort to the family who do absolutely know that they can pin you as the murderer of their gorgeous, darling girl. Now, there's a twist to this, isn't there? It's one of the reasons that I've covered this case today, and that is because Michael Stone is a man who is currently in prison. He's currently in prison because he was accused of murdering a woman and her daughter and seriously injuring another one of her daughters. Michael Stone had an awful life, I'm not going to lie. Grew up with horrible domestic violence. He was placed in a care home. His police record's horrific. Goes right back to when he was 12 years old, and he was a career criminal. It's as simple as that. In care, he was a criminal. When he left care, he was a criminal. And pretty much when he left care, he started using heroin. He'd been in and out of prison from the 80s and 90s for robbery, burglary, grievous bodily harm, assault. He was really not the kind of guy that you wanted to get into a fight with. He was aggressive. So as I tell this, I don't want you to think that I'm saying that this particular man is a good man with a good heart. Obviously, he's done some horrific crimes, but he's also had a really traumatic upbringing. He was accused and found guilty of the murder of Lynn Russell. Now, Lynn wasn't the typical MO for Levi Bellfield. She had dark curly hair, but she did have two daughters with her, 6-year-old Megan and 9-year-old Josie, and their dog Lucy. It was a horrific attack. It was a horrific attack. They were all tied up and they were beaten mercilessly, including their dog. It was in Chillenden, Kent. They had literally been walking home from a swimming gala. Lynn, Megan and their dog Lucy were all killed, but Josie survived. And I followed this case for years because I always wanted to know that Josie was okay, and she is okay. She's made an incredible life for herself. She's okay. But that poor girl who doesn't remember the event was beaten savagely. Her sister, her mother and her dog all killed. I have to tell you, Michael Stone was arrested after it was shown on Crime Watch. There was a reconstruction done, but he's always denied committing the killings of all of them. He's always said, I will not accept that I am guilty. He pleaded not guilty at the original trial in 1998, but he was put into prison because of the testimony of a guy called Damien Daly. He said that Michael Stone had told him that he had done that whilst he was in prison. So he said that he had admitted his guilt whilst in prison. That witness testimony, which with respect to me is a very loose witness testimony, is how it came to pass that Michael Stone went to prison and is still in prison. There was no other evidence. There was no forensics. There was no real motive. And it certainly wasn't in character with his normal type of criminal behaviour. Remember, you can see patterns in criminal behaviour. That said, I don't know whether he killed those poor people or not. I don't know. That poor child, I don't know. But he did get a retrial because that very same witness who said that he confessed to him, he retracted his witness testimony. But still, Michael Stone was found guilty. And still, he says he's innocent. And in 2023, Michael Stone can get out, but he won't because he says he's innocent and he will not admit his guilt. Because if he admits his guilt, the person responsible for that poor woman, her daughter and her dog's death will be walking free, potentially. And that does make me concerned. It makes me concerned because why would you want to stay in prison past the day you can get out? I do want to also mention that an inquiry took place after his conviction because they wanted to look at whether there'd been failings in his care. He'd been involved in the mental health service. He had expressed violent tendencies and thoughts. But when the inquiry explored, they said this was emphatically, in their words, emphatically not a case of a man with a dangerous personality disorder being generally ignored by agencies or left at large. So is it possible, therefore, that that's because he didn't strike them as a dangerous offender? Now, this is why I've done this particular video, because it's coming out that Michael Stone could be cleared. He could be cleared after police found lost evidence 14 years after it was found. A bootlace that was used to tie up one of the girls retrieved from the scene in Chillenden, Kent in 1996 and then misplaced has now been rediscovered. And DNA tests could prove that Stone, who's now 60, isn't guilty. Whilst they did initially have some small fibres, this is back in the day when DNA was very, very rudimentary, but now it's unbelievable. Now it can tie people to a crime or not to a crime. So literally in October last year, 2020, the lace was found at a police station. Now, we do have a problem because when you look at forensics, they have to be forensically secured, so they can't be contaminated, because obviously if people touch it, it becomes a contaminated piece of evidence. So if it hasn't been kept securely, that does mean there may have been a problem. But we know that Levi Bellfield has actually reported that he was near the scene where Lynn and Megan Russell were murdered. So he's admitted that he was near the area that those individuals were murdered. And we know his MO. He's a blitz killer. He just acts on that impulse and goes and carries out the most hideous of crimes. We know he likes caving in people's heads with hammers. That's the kind of way he kills. And also, it turns out that he's talked about the fact that he was very familiar with the area where that mother and daughter were literally bludgeoned to death. Also, to add to that, there's a description of a man leaving the scene of the crime that fits exactly with Levi Bellfield's description. And also, somebody said that they saw a beige Ford van, like the one that Bellfield drove at the time, speeding away from the scene. And also, if I'm honest, the pièce de résistance, it turns out that he's also admitted it to another inmate. Currently, the CCRC is reviewing a fresh application so that Michael Stone can hopefully get an appeal. But he wants to have the conviction for the murders of Lynn and Megan Russell and the attempted murder of Josie Russell squashed. I don't know whether that will happen. What I do know is that if there is any reasonable doubt that there has been a false conviction, then it should be explored. Michael Stone still claims that he's innocent. And the police, well, I think we can all agree that they, all of us, and anyone who knew Levi Bellfield, believe that he's linked to many other murders, rapes, and random attacks. It's good to know that he won't be walking our streets, isn't it? But I wonder how many other people have been killed by him. And also, look at his MO. Look at the way that when he's in rage, when he feels inadequate, he kills. And imagine how many times a man like him would have felt that way. We won't know for a while whether Michael Stone was actually found guilty when he shouldn't have been. But if so, I hope he gets out. I really do. And I hope he's compensated for a life that was taken from him. And I hope that Levi Bellfield is found guilty of that crime. But like I said, that's not for me to answer. I hope you found today's case interesting. Thanks for joining me. As I always say, please subscribe. If you don't subscribe, just let me know why. I'll try and do better. I love your likes. I love the conversation. Thanks for joining me in this premiere. I really appreciate it. Take care.